So, at the risk of repeating that, but allow me, if you will, just to spend a few minutes explaining how I come to find myself here. I spent most of my life in Oxford, but moved to the Isle of Wight in 2014, where Peter Clarke and the Isle of Wight Catholic History Society kindly took me under their wing. And I was very surprised to discover that the first 3 Catholic bishops of Portsmouth had all spent time living in Ryde, Sleepy Ryde on the north coast of the Isle of Wight. I investigated this further, and this finally culminated in the early bishops of Portsmouth, which I call EBOPS, which was produced by the Isle of Wight Catholic History Society in 2020. The 4th bishop, Archbishop King, much research has been done into him, and he had no connection with Ryde. So I just did the first 3, but I have half a plan to go back and carry on that research in time for the 150th anniversary of the Diocese of Portsmouth in 2032. After Portsmouth, I rather peeped over the diocesan boundary, if you can do that, and wrote the Roman Catholic bishops of Oundle and Brighton, a young diocese only dating back to 1965. And again, this was produced by the Isle of Wight Catholic History Society in 2021. Unfortunately, it came out in mid-pandemic, and it never really found its wings, although Bishop Moth was very enthusiastic and very helpful about the project. As a little plug, both of these volumes are available from the Isle of Wight Catholic History Society website. Please do go and have a look if you're interested, and get in touch with Peter, the chairman, and he will happily send them to you. Then I thought it was probably time that I did a proper diocese, so to speak, or I rather don't really mean proper, an historic diocese. That is to say, one finding its origins in the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy in 1850. Perhaps a certain nostalgia for my student days in Durham prompted me to pick Hexham and Newcastle, and so that in brief is how I come to find myself here this evening. Hexham and Newcastle seemed a bit beyond the brief of the Isle of Wight Catholic History Society, and so, as has already been mentioned, my text was published by Sacristy Press, based in Durham, in April this year. Finally, I might add that I've spent 7 months from November last year until June of this year living and working in Cumbria, where I was researching and started the writing of the Catholic Bishops of Lancaster, which was formed out of the western part of the Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle and part of the then Diocese of Liverpool. And the idea is to bring that out for the centenary of Lancaster Diocese in 2024. I've given talks about things I've written before, and I find myself in something of a dilemma if I'm trying to actually sell a book. If I give a brilliant talk, you'll all say, well, that was a brilliant talk. I know everything I need to know now about the Catholic bishops of Hexham and Newcastle, so there's no point buying the book. On the other hand, if I give a rubbish talk, you'll say, well, that was rubbish. If that was the talk, I certainly don't need to buy the book. So it's a lose-lose situation, it seems to me. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to give the best talk that I can, but it is going to be incomplete. So I'm just going to pick out my favourite bits, as it were, and tell you about them in the hope that this will wet your whistles, whet your appetites, and you'll think, oh yes, I need to read the rest of the story, and I'll go and buy the book. So you will recall, I'm sure, that after the Reformation, England and Wales was divided into 4, and then subsequently in 1848, apostolic vicariates. But then at the restoration of the hierarchy in 1850, the Metropolitan Archdiocese of Westminster was established, along with a further 12 suffragan dioceses. One of these was the Diocese of Hexham, which was originally a 7th century diocese, which, along with Lindisfarne, was transferred to Durham in the 10th century. At the restoration in 1850, the Church of St Mary in Newcastle, a much bigger centre of population than Hexham, was raised to the rank of cathedral. So, who was the first bishop? The first bishop for the new diocese was a man called William Hogarth, who had previously been administrator of the Northern District following the death of Bishop William Riddle in November 1847, until he, Hogarth that is, was ordained bishop in 1848 and appointed vicar apostolic. Hogarth was, to my mind, an impossibly energetic and indeed an indefatigable man. He was apparently rather small, only 5'6" to 5'8", and rather untidy in his appearance. He had broad shoulders, muscular arms, and big hands, a strong jaw showing pugnacity, but gentle grey eyes, and overall a charming face. He was born at Dodding Green near Kendal in Cumbria in 1786, where his family had retained their land and their faith through penal times. And he was sent, barely aged 10, along with his brother Richard, to Crook Hall near Durham. And I'm sure you know, but Crook Hall was the sort of precursor to the seminary at Ushaw, but it was established in Crook Hall to begin with. So he went to Crook Hall and then he moved on to Ushaw afterwards. The regime was austere by modern standards, and we can imagine it would have been very cold indeed in the winter. Additionally, in 1808 to 1809, there was a typhus outbreak and 5 Ushaw students died within a month. But Hogarth survived it all and would later acknowledge the quality of the education he had received there. He was ordained priest at Ushaw in 1809 at a time when the college was in its infancy. In fact, it was one, and then later we'll come back and see that the centenary was celebrated in 100 years later, 1908. After his ordination as a priest, Hogarth was kept at Ushaw to serve as a prefect general. It's a sort of title within the seminary, probably doing a little teaching, and 2 years later he was appointed bursar at Ushaw. There was very, very little money to go round, but Hogarth showed great frugality and prudence and made a good job of bursaring, although there is some suggestion that constant worries about money tired him out. He left Ushaw in 1816 and served as chaplain for some time to the Withen family at Cliff Hall in Yorkshire. In 1824, Cliff Hall was sold and the Catholic mission there was amalgamated with the mission in Darlington, and Hogarth moved decisively, as we shall see, to Darlington. In brief, whoopsie daisy, hold on a minute, there's my text gone. Oh. In brief, Hogarth had a new church built to serve the rapidly growing population. Not only were there lots of Irish immigrants arriving in the northeast because of the rapid expansion of industry, but also there was a steady flow of English converts to Catholicism at that time. Hogarth established a school, and indeed he regarded in Darlington, and indeed he regarded a basic Catholic education as an essential pastoral tool and a fundamental aspect of Catholic social teaching. He raised funds and promoted education, and indeed, when he was Vicar Apostolic in 1849, he wrote in the first of his pastoral letters, and I quote, "It is then the duty of all Catholics who value the great blessings of education to make every effort to meet the benevolent intentions of government, now, for the first time, offering to assist in the education of the Catholic poor. Natural compassion for our brethren urges us, a deep conviction of the necessity of education loudly calls upon us, and religion commands us to contribute liberally to the Christian education of the poor." Additionally, we might also observe that as bishop, Hogarth invited the Sisters of Mercy from Cork to set up religious houses and schools in the diocese, and houses and schools were established in Sunderland, Hexham, Durham, and by the end of his episcopate in 1866, there were 7 schools altogether throughout the diocese. In many ways, this is a story in itself, but it underlines Hogarth's determination and his ability to put his educational principles into practice at the time. Also, it underlines the value that he attached to his own education at Ushaw. Hogarth was offered a move to a wealthier parish, but he declined this offer and remained in Darlington. And when he was appointed diocesan bishop in 1850, he was 64 years old, and it is said that by that time he knew his own mind, and he remained in his modest accommodation at St Augustine's Presbytery in Darlington. 11 years later, as I'm sure many of you will know, the Diocese of Hexham was renamed the Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle, although the boundaries of the territory were the same, and Hogarth remained as bishop, becoming Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle, Bishop of the new see. He is remembered as hugely energetic and a very capable administrator. It is said that every church and chapel was either built or enlarged under his management. In 1851, there were 70 priests in the diocese, including the 11 at Ushaw, 51 public chapels and 3 convents. But 15 years later, by 1866, there had been a 30% increase in the clerical body to 102 priests, while the number of public chapels had gone up by 60% to 81, and there were 11 convents. It has been estimated that mass attendance doubled in the diocese between 1851 and 1861. There is, of course, more that can be said and more that you can read, but exhausted by his labours, Bishop Hogarth died without long illness and still in office in 1866, aged 80. His requiem took place in his beloved Darlington, although his body was removed and buried at Ushaw, as many of the bishops' bodies are. A memorial in his honour was erected in Darlington, which bears the description, "To the Right Reverend William Hogarth, D.D., first Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle, the father of his clergy and the poor, who by a saintly life, great labours and charity unbounded, won love and veneration from all." This monument was erected by his flock and fellow townsmen of every creed and party. So in summary, born at Dodding Green, Westmoreland, died at Darlington, 29th of January 1866, buried at St Cuthbert's College, aged 80 years. So that was the first bishop for whom education was the real centre of his ministry in many, many ways. Bishop Hogarth was succeeded by Bishop James Chadwick, about whom I shall deliberately say very little, except that he was an Irishman, although his family originated in Lancashire. He too trained at Ushaw, and as bishop he took up residence in what was for a long time the bishop's house at Rye Hill in Newcastle. He attended the First Vatican Council and was appointed assistant at the pontifical throne, and he did much to build up the diocese and established, significantly, sort of carrying on the story of his predecessor, he established the provision of secondary Catholic education in Newcastle by founding St Cuthbert's Grammar School. And he left a number of written works, including a couple of hymns. Again, I'm going to skip over the third bishop, Bishop Bewick, who, it is worth noting, maintained his own parochial residence at Front Street in Tynemouth when he was made bishop, and I shall come back to that in a minute. So that's where he was. He was in Tynemouth. That was the presbytery, and when he became bishop, the episcopal residence stayed there in Tynemouth. And now I'm going to come to the most unusual of the bishops, and for that reason, perhaps my favourite, the fourth bishop of Hexham and Newcastle, Henry O'Callaghan, who was a truly remarkable fellow, I think. He studied at St Edmund's College in Ware and was ordained priest for the Westminster Archdiocese in 1851. And he joined the London-based Oblates of St Charles, which was an institute of secular priests established by Cardinal Manning and based on, for their inspiration, the Oblates of St Ambrose, originally established by St Charles Borromeo. As an oblate, O'Callaghan became involved in the running of the seminary at Ware under Cardinal Vaughan, who was at the time vice president. But when the oblates withdrew from the seminary in 1861, O'Callaghan was sent to head up a new oblate house in Rome. 6 years after this, Father Frederick Neve, the rector of the Venerable English College in Rome, resigned, and O'Callaghan, who had become so highly regarded running his oblate house, was appointed to replace him as rector of the Venerabile. Again, skipping over some of the details here, O'Callaghan and his deputy, Dr. Giles, did much to improve and indeed rebuild the Venerabile. His time there was conspicuously successful, and as a reward for his efforts, he was appointed the fourth bishop of Hexham and Newcastle. By all accounts, O'Callaghan did not want the job, and he was so anxious that he became unwell as his episcopal ordination approached. And although it was originally planned for the 18th of December 1887, he just couldn't go through with it, and it had to be postponed. And it seems that O'Callaghan tried to get out of the preferment altogether, but to no avail. He had to be obedient to his superiors, because he was an oblate, and he was finally ordained bishop in Rome. One eyewitness recalls, and this is a nice quotation, one eyewitness recalls, quote, "When it was nearly over, a lady who was near to me, and to whom I had just explained a few details of the function, suddenly said impetuously, 'How I hate it all!' For the moment, I thought she was a Protestant, and simply said, 'Why?' The whispered answer came back, 'Why can't they leave him here? You don't know what a friend he has been, and how many will miss him.'" On the 17th of February, O'Callaghan left Rome and travelled to his new diocese. He was enthroned in his cathedral on the 18th of March in what was described as an inspiring ceremony, and one made still more awe-inspiring from the public avowal of the loyalty and fidelity of the clergy to one who had been placed over them by the Holy Father himself, and whose name had not even been on the Turner, the shortlist of candidates to become a new diocesan bishop. Nevertheless, how inspiring it was to those who looked on, as the preacher compared the northerly climate in Newcastle with the blue skies of Rome, tears streamed down the new bishop's face. And as already mentioned, we can imagine that O'Callaghan regarded his Front Street residence in Tynemouth about as far as Rome as it was possible to be. I don't know how many of you know that neck of the woods, but the wind and the rain lash in from the North Sea. I've never been there, but I can imagine it could be pretty bleak at times. And as I say, about as far from Rome as it was pretty much possible to be in terms of climate, if not in terms of miles. For poor old O'Callaghan's seminary life had been no preparation for running a diocese, and remember that he'd not even run a parish. And so O'Callaghan appointed Canon Wilkinson as his vicar general and would do nothing without his advice. Some 10 weeks later, he returned to Rome and arranged for Wilkinson to be ordained as bishop and appointed as his auxiliary. And Wilkinson was ordained bishop on the 25th of July, 1888. O'Callaghan returned to England just for a time, but a year later he resigned as Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle on the 27th of September, 1889. The role of bishop was beyond him. He was awarded a generous pension from the diocese and he returned to Rome, being appointed as the titular Archbishop of Nicosia. He spent his remaining days in Rome and later in Florence. It would seem that he tried to go back to live at the Venerabile, but Dr. Giles, who had succeeded him, would not, and I think quite sensibly, would not permit it. We may imagine that O'Callaghan helped out here and there, performed a few ordinations from time to time, but in all truth, very little is known about this period of his life. Eventually, he had a stroke that paralysed the right side of his body, and he went to live with a little company of Mary, the Blue Nuns, at their nursing home in Florence. It is remembered towards the end of his life that he was unable to say Mass himself, but that he had a room near the chapel and was taken to Mass each day in his wheelchair. It is said that he was very patient, made no complaints, and that his rosary was scarcely out of his hands. He died at the Little Company of Mary nursing home on the 11th of October 1904, aged 77, and was buried at the San Miniato al Monte cemetery in Firenze in Florence. Perhaps ironically, although he was the shortest serving Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle by quite a long chalk, and he was the only bishop not really to ever take up permanent residence in the diocese, he is also the only one thus far to be raised to the rank of Archbishop, and the only one buried outside the UK. I think it's interesting to ponder whether that's the sort of thing that a bishop should do. You could say, well, he sort of abandoned his post really and didn't rise to the challenge. But on the other hand, he didn't really want to be a bishop, and I actually think he was quite heroic in resigning and doing the honourable thing to let a better man come along. But I suppose that's a discussion that we can perhaps have later. But it's interesting to me to think that because he was so successful in the seminary, that didn't really mean he was going to be successful as a bishop, and indeed it was something he didn't want. I mentioned, so Bishop Wilkinson succeeded Bishop O'Callaghan, and he was another truly remarkable character. As I've said, he was made Vicar General and in fact took over, but the story is rather more complicated than that. So Bishop Wilkinson was born 5th of April 1825 at Harperley Park near Stanley in County Durham, the son of a well-to-do lawyer. Indeed, the lawyer had a branch line off the main train line into his estate so that he could access the trains more easily. Wilkinson went to school at Harrow and then studied at Durham University, where he was awarded a BA in theology and a license in theology. And I think he's the only Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle to have a Durham theology degree. Following graduation, he was ordained in the Church of England, but under the influence of the Oxford movement, he converted to Catholicism and then studied for 2 years at Oscott, and then was ordained priest for the Northern District on the 23rd of December 1848 in the chapel at Ushaw by the first Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle, Bishop Hogarth. He was sent to be a missionary at, I think it's pronounced Towlaw, it might be Towlaw, but I think it's Towlaw in Weardale, south of Consett, and he established a mission at Walsingham. I need to just stress that's Walsingham with an O, not Walsingham with an A, and subsequently served in Crook. He was remembered there as an energetic and much-loved priest and pastor. He encouraged the Sisters of Charity to found a house in Crook to assist in the school, and the nuns arrived in 1862. And in 1865, in recognition of all his hard work, Wilkinson was appointed canon of the chapter of the newly created Diocese of Hexham and Newcastle. But in 1869, aged only 44, Wilkinson stood down as parish priest on account of his health, having suffered, we think, something of a breakdown. And later he would write that his retirement, quote, was ordered by a very eminent physician in London. So aged 44, he packs it all in, so to speak, and retires. He bought a farm, because remember the family was very wealthy. He bought a farm at Thistle Flat from some of his relatives and retired there, spending his days managing the estate. In particular, and possibly uniquely for a bishop, he specialised in the rearing of Durham Shorthorns, which are a pedigree breed of cattle. And his diaries for the time reveal a considerable grasp of agricultural technicalities. So he was sort of farmer bishop. And presumably really not a very well man for a while if his physician said that he really needed to stand down. But as we've seen, when Henry O'Callaghan became bishop, he installed Canon Wilkinson as provost and vicar general to administer the affairs of the diocese. It seems that Wilkinson was uncertain about whether this was a role he wanted to take on, but a letter exists in the archives at Ushaw from Wilkinson's brother to him, congratulating him on his elevation and assuring him that he, Wilkinson, should have no apprehension of being unequal to the charge. And that's a quote, nasty double negative, but never mind. He should have no apprehension of being unequal to the charge. O'Callaghan returned to Rome some 10 weeks after his enthronement in Newcastle, and subsequently Wilkinson was appointed titular Bishop of Sisamus and auxiliary Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle. He was ordained Bishop at Ushaw on the 25th of July by Bishop William Clifford of the Clifton Diocese, assisted by Archbishop Charles Eyre from Glasgow and Bishop Arthur Riddell from Northampton. Bishop O'Callaghan, his predecessor, is conspicuous by his absence. Bishop O'Callaghan resigned the see the following year, and Wilkinson was translated to be the 5th Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle. What is even more amazing is 9 months later, Dr. James Lennon, who was the less than efficient 11th President of Ushaw, resigned on the grounds of poor health. And as this was the second resignation in Ushaw within 2 years, the Board of Governors of the college requested that the new bishop take charge of the college, initially, as it happens, for 12 months. Wilkinson accepted this invitation at the October 1890 board meeting and took up residence at the college as rector, living there as president or rector, same thing, living there until the end of his life, 20 years later. So having retired from ministry, having moved to a farm and bred cattle, he's then suddenly rocketed into being made bishop and made rector of a seminary also, which strikes me as quite unusual, or it is unusual. In the first instance, Ushaw's finances needed to be placed on a secure footing, and Wilkinson's previous experience in parishes, and no doubt on his farm, paid off. And it is said that his aptitude for managing the accounts amounted to near genius. He introduced a properly recognised system of bookkeeping. He employed a lay clerk to assist in the handling of the accounts, and he brought his farming experience to bear on the management of the farm at Ushaw, appointing procurators and prefects to ensure the efficient day-to-day running of the college. This careful financial management enabled repairs, alterations, and indeed extensions of the buildings of the college to be carried out. In particular, new dormitories were built, A new sanitary block, modern gas lighting was installed. Later, a cricket pavilion, a gymnasium, and even a swimming pool were all added. On a slightly separate front, it was Wilkinson who established the close links between Ushaw and Durham University, of which he was a graduate. Suitable students at Ushaw were encouraged to attend lectures at Durham, and some even sat for Durham degrees. 5 times in 7 years, students from Ushaw took the University Classical Scholarship. Furthermore, the students who had studied at Durham helped to improve the academic attainment at Ushaw too, returning as minor professors and raising the standards all round. In 1894, approaching his 70th birthday and exhausted by all his labours, Wilkinson wrote to Cardinal Vaughan, begging him to supplicate with the Holy See that he, Wilkinson, might be allowed to resign. He pointed out that for some years now, and I quote, "locomotion has been difficult for me," and he adds that he would not be a financial burden to the diocese, having ample private means of my own. But no doubt because of all his successes, not unlike his predecessor, his resignation request was not granted, and Vaughan recommended that Wilkinson seek additional assistance in the form of a coadjutor bishop. The recommendation was transmitted to Wilkinson in a letter from Rome, which began, "Most illustrious and most reverend Lord." Splendidly. The Pope made him an assistant at the pontifical throne. Where's my cursor gone? Whoopsie daisy. Oh dear. Here we go. Sorry, the Pope made him an assistant at the pontifical throne, and Newcastle upon Tyne made him a freeman of the city. And some years later, I think it's 3 or 4 years later, he was finally granted an auxiliary bishop to help him out. His final task, as alluded to very fleetingly earlier, his final task was to prepare for and preside over the centenary celebrations at Ushaw, and these celebrations occupied 3 full days at the end of July 1908, during which time Ushaw welcomed 400 visitors, among them Archbishop Bourne from Westminster, who was a student at the college for some years, and 11 other bishops. Pontifical masses in the chapel, newly decorated for the occasion, took place, dinners and speeches, a special play commissioned from Robert Hugh Benson dealing with the story of John Bost, one of the Dowie priests who worked in the vicinity of the college during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and other customary trappings of English centenaries filled the few days. The president rallied sufficiently to be able to assist at almost every function, a frail and bowed but venerable prelate of 83. Pope Pius X sent a message of congratulations to Bishop Wilkinson and the whole Ushaw community. In December, following these celebrations in the December, Wilkinson celebrated the Diamond Jubilee of his priestly ordination in the very chapel where he had been ordained, but by this time he was really very frail. He was anointed, and in the first few days of March 1909, and died peacefully the following month, 17th of April 1909, and many telegrams and letters of condolence were sent to Monsignor Corbishley, who succeeded Wilkinson as college president. And these are a testament to the high regard in which he was held by so many. He left his entire estate, a fortune of over £50,000. I'm sorry, I don't actually know what that is from 1909 times to currently, but obviously a very large amount of money. He left the whole amount to Ushaw College for the education of priests in the county of Durham, which he had loved so much. So again, I think he's another truly remarkable figure, from having sort of resigned from the parish because of ill health and then done all this farming and then become the bishop and then become the rector of Ushaw as well. Just a truly remarkable man. And I suppose I have being a Durham graduate myself, he's the only one who's a Durham graduate, so I sort of feel a bond is the wrong word, but an affinity. So he was the 5th bishop. I'm going to skip over the 6th bishop and just briefly mention the 7th bishop, who is quite remarkable, Bishop Joseph Thorman. He was unusual. His father died when he was very young, and his poverty-struck mother had no option than to put young Joseph into an orphanage. And the records exist of Joseph Thorman being in an orphanage. Fortunately, his mother was able to remarry, and he married she married a wealthy German engineer, and Joseph was reunited with his mother and his siblings. And in fact, they were Anglicans to begin with, but the German father was a Catholic, and that's how Thorman became a Catholic. More significantly then, perhaps, is his episcopate, when it comes to it, is characterized very strongly by a concern for the poor and destitute children of the diocese. And his major work was with poor and destitute children. He also is noted for assisting Belgian refugees during the First World War, and was decorated by the Belgian state for all of his efforts. Lastly, in this rather potted history, but deliberately potted, I want to say a few words about the 11th bishop, Bishop Ambrose Griffiths, the only Benedictine bishop the diocese has ever had, and strictly speaking, the only religious bishop. I don't want to get too technical, but Bishop Robert Byrne, who is a member of the Congregation of the Oratory, and really that's a congregation of secular priests. They're not religious, because they make promises which they renew and they don't take vows. Anyway, never mind. So Ambrose was born John. Ambrose was the name he took in religion. He was born John Griffiths in Twickenham, and he went to Ampleforth. He went to school at Ampleforth. And did very well at Ampleforth, and then went up to Balliol College afterwards and read chemistry, showing some brilliance, and was awarded a first in chemistry. Quite a rarity in 1950, I might add. It's not quite like today, where many first class degrees are awarded, but we won't get onto that perhaps at the moment. So he got his first in chemistry, and on completion of his studies, he planned to become a research fellow and remain in Oxford, and even thought that he might become a don. But unfortunately, it's a slightly strange story, but another student at Balliol went a bit berserk, had a bit of a mental breakdown, and destroyed all of Griffiths' chemistry notes. And for whatever reason, it made Griffiths have a rethink, and he decided not to become a research fellow in chemistry, and he returned to Ampleforth. On returning to Ampleforth, he took the name Ambrose, as I've mentioned, and he taught in the school there, teaching chemistry and other sciences. He subsequently served as bursar to the monastery, and was eventually elected abbot of Ampleforth in 1976, when Basil Hume went to Westminster. And in 1992, Pope St. John Paul II announced Griffiths as the 11th bishop of Hexham and Newcastle. According to the story, Griffiths received a phone call from Liverpool asking him to visit the Archbishop, who told him the Pope had appointed him Bishop of Hexham and Newcastle. The following day, so surprised by the nomination, he telephoned Archbishop Warlock in Liverpool to check that the offer was not just a dream. And it is said that the efficient Archbishop, who had occasionally encountered vagueness amongst monks before, assured him that his memory was correct, and the Pope did indeed want him to accept the appointment. He arrived in the diocese like a gust of fresh air, renewing and invigorating. Because he'd calculated, there was the clergy, the number of clergy were in decline at that time, and he calculated that if the clergy decline continued at the same rate, the diocese would close in 2038. And so he started a process of renewal and regrowth. His view of the church was very much a product of the council, but he had a vision ahead of his time, and he wanted collaboration between clergy and laity to be at the heart of church life. He urged his parishioners to be more friendly and non-judgmental towards outsiders. He believed in the work of pastoral councils, and reorganised the diocesan pastoral council and set up the council of the laity. At diocesan functions, he tried to speak with as many people as possible, talking with them easily, and often being the last to leave. In particular, he was notably at ease with young people, playfully encouraging those seeking suitable spouses to pray to the Archangel Raphael, the patron of happy marriages. One story, again, which illustrates Griffiths' commitment to the young, is that when Pope John Paul II convened the World Youth Day in Rome, Bishop Ambrose travelled to Rome on a coach with a group of young people from his diocese. Quite oblivious to the inevitable noise around him, he would put his head down and sleep, waking refreshed and ready to engage with his travelling companions. It is no surprise, perhaps, that Bishop Griffiths has been dubbed Bishop for the Young. A second important strand of his work, however, was an interest in and a commitment to charismatic renewal. Charisms are special gifts of the Holy Spirit over and above those strictly needed for salvation. They are given to individuals or groups for the benefit of the church and the world. Charismatic renewal movements emphasize the recognition and the use of these charisms, which include healing, prophecy, speaking in tongues, and the like, just to mention a few. Pentecostal Christians emphasize baptism in the Spirit above all else, but within the Catholic Church there has been talk of renewal since the 1960s, with the Called and Gifted scheme in the UK perhaps being the most well known in recent times. Originally, Griffiths had said that he did not know much about the charismatic renewal and that it was not really his thing. But one evening at Ampleforth, when he was procurator, bursar in other words, he was emotionally and spiritually very low. He had heard there was a charismatic group staying at Ampleforth for the weekend, and he crept into the back of their meeting and sat down. Father Sean Collety was speaking, and Griffiths reported that as he listened and looked around at the attentiveness of the people, suddenly a deep peace came over him. He said it was as if a light had gone on deep within him, and from then on he was a different person from the one who had crept into the meeting. When Bishop Langton Fox, the liaison bishop to the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, died, Cardinal Hume appointed Griffiths to be the new liaison bishop. Following his retirement from Hexham and Newcastle, Griffiths was awarded the honorary degree of DCL by Northumbria University, and their Vice-Chancellor at the time, Professor Kell Gidler, said that, quote, Bishop Ambrose Griffiths is an excellent role model for our graduates. He is a brilliant scholar with an analytic mind, but understands how true success can only be achieved by working with people. This is a fantastic message for our graduates as they embark on their careers. Teresa Smith, a friend of Bishop Ambrose, recalls, quote, he was so pleased, and it was the only time I ever saw him look like the cat that got the cream. He laughed heartily when I told him this, but did not deny it. When he resigned or retired, when he reached his 75th birthday, he didn't go back to Ampleforth. It's not customary for religious bishops to go back to their communities, although sometimes they do, but often they don't. And so he didn't go back to Ampleforth. He went to Leyland over in Cumbria, which was a Benedictine parish run from ancient times from Ampleforth. In 2011, he was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, which was terminal, although it is said those who visited him during his final illness found him joyful, efficient, and even optimistic, comforting those who had come to comfort him. He was admitted to hospital after Easter that year, where he remained for a month, but when it became evident there was no more that the doctors could do for him, he returned to his home to die, and so not Ampleforth, but the parish in Leyland. The weekend after his return, he attended Sunday Mass in a wheelchair and was determined to thank individually all those who had sent him cards and good wishes. Towards the very end, his family prayed the office for him, and the monks offered Mass in his room. Eventually, he needed more care than could be provided at his home, and he was transferred to a local hospice for the very last few days of his life. He died in Leyland on the 14th of June 2011, aged 82. His requiem took place in Newcastle Cathedral, and his body was buried at Ampleforth. Many of the bishops, in fact, as I've alluded to, were buried at Ushaw, but not all of them. We've seen O'Callaghan was buried in Florence, and Griffiths is the only bishop of Hexham and Newcastle to be buried at Ampleforth. So I hope that just sort of gives you a flavour of these remarkable men who have all held this post. And so in the final chapter of my book, I try and make a few sort of remarks that ties it all together. So to conclude, the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches that the role or task of the bishops, who have the fullness of the sacrament of holy orders, is to teach, sanctify, and govern. And similarly, St. Gregory, in his famous rule for bishops, the Regula Pastoralis of 590, taught that a bishop is to be a teacher and physician of souls, to preach, reprove, rebuke, and exhort by precept and example, guiding all souls to salvation. Without wanting to judge, we can say that these criteria provide a sort of a framework to assess, or not really assess, to characterise the bishops of Hexham and Newcastle. What were their respective strengths and weaknesses? Or to put the question in a slightly different fashion, what do these bishops have in common, and what are the differences between them? It is fascinating to me that 14 bishops and 2 auxiliaries, who were all called or appointed to the same task, to teach, sanctify and govern their diocese, could approach and execute this task in such a variety of different ways. Sir Anthony Selden, former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham and historian, recently presented a series of radio programmes marking 300 years of British Prime Ministers. I had to mention the Prime Ministers today, from Sir Robert Walpole to Boris Johnson. And I was struck when I listened to these radio programmes, forcefully struck by the sheer variety of the personalities and personal stories behind a group of people ostensibly all doing the same job. And whilst I would hesitate to describe being a diocesan bishop as a job, it is not entirely dissimilar with the bishops. Some were great builders of the diocese. Hogarth, the first bishop, established the new diocese, organising parishes and clergy, establishing churches, and setting the diocese on the path that we see today. Chadwick too developed and continued this work and invited many religious congregations to the diocese, following his extensive review in the late 1860s. And Bishop Thorman similarly did much to rebuild the diocese after the First World War, establishing new churches and church schools. His successor, Joseph McCormack, had the same task of rebuilding the diocese, although arguably this was an even bigger task after the ravages of the Second World War. Many of the bishops had a particular interest in education, founding and nurturing Catholic schools. Hogarth, again, as I've suggested, recognised education as a way out of poverty and founded St Augustine's Primary School in Darlington. His successor, Chadwick, opened St Cuthbert's Grammar School in Newcastle, which was further developed and supported by Bishop Bewick. And in the 20th century, Bishop McCormack worked tirelessly to further the causes of Catholic education and defend the right of the Church to educate its own in the faith. Bishop Seamus Cunningham studied religious education and catechesis in Bayswater and handed on the fruits of his labours to the diocese in the late 1970s. Many of the bishops were notable scholars. Chadwick, Bewick, O'Callaghan and Preston, one of the auxiliaries, were all doctors of divinity, and Bewick in particular was regarded as a brilliant Latin scholar. Bishop Swindlehurst was exceptional in holding 3 pontifical licenses in philosophy, theology and canon law, and Griffiths was distinguished by his first in chemistry from Oxford. Not an insignificant achievement, as I have suggested, in 1950. A number of the bishops are particularly noted for their pastoral zeal. Thorman, at one time an orphan, established social provision for Catholic children in the diocese and founded the Children's Care and Homes Committee. He was also closely involved with the work of the Catholic Guild and served as its president. Griffiths, as I have mentioned, was given the sobriquet Bishop for the Young and established the youth ministry team and was closely involved with visits to Papal World Youth Days. Bishop Dunn was similarly involved with the youth in his diocese, having previously found himself in the frontline pastoral position during the Handsworth riots of the mid-1980s. Bishop Byrne, who I'm deliberately not going to say a great deal about, but he's noted, I don't know if you know, but he's noted for his lifelong commitment to ministry to people in prison. And as I've said, 2 of the bishops, and as I say at the end of the book, there are 2 bishops who do seem to me to inherit categories of their own, Bishop Wilkinson and Bishop O'Callaghan, who I started talking about, and can only really be described as sui generis, and I just find them completely fascinating people, as I hope I've given you a flavour for that. These then, and some others who I've not really mentioned deliberately, are the men who have steered and guided the Petrine bark in Hexham and Newcastle over the last 170 or so years. The story as I have presented it is incomplete, as I have not been able to include every detail. But furthermore, as soon as the story is complete, or the final full stop in the book is written, it starts to go out of date as history unfolds. But the record of history is ever thus, necessarily partial and always part of a larger work in progress. And so I present this work as a contribution, a summary of the work of a group of significant men whose ministry may be traced back to Oswald, Aidan, and Cuthbert in the 7th century, and whose successors will extend into the indeterminacy of the future. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much for our wonderful talk. I'm just going to